Hey, boys and girls. So today in reading, you're going to again need your novel study. This time you're going to have to flip for a while. You'll see a page that looks like this, where you have Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And then right after it, it has chapters 1 through 3. Today we're going to read chapters 2 and 3. And we already read chapter 1. So then after you do that, you're going to answer the questions in your novel study packet. So again, you're going to start, and I'll go over this again in class. When we start, you'll see there's your character one. We should have filled in this one yesterday. And then you'll see one that looks like this that says setting. We're going to keep going. And then you'll see one that looks like this that says reading activities. Now you're almost there. We're going to do the roll doll one together in class. Then they have some text to self, text to connection, text to text, cause and effect, text to world. We're going to go all the way until we see this one, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And then at the top of this page, it says chapters 1 through 3. Only this page is what we're doing for classwork today. Okay, I hope that's clear. And let's get to reading. So yesterday when we left off, he said, oh, how he wished he could go inside the factory and see what it was like. So let's start on chapter 2. Now, if you're reading along in your book, that is totally okay, but I'm going to read from the screen. And if you have trouble following along in your book, you can always follow the screen. That's why I share it. In the evenings, after he had finished his supper of watery cabbage soup, Charlie always went into the room of his 4 grandparents to listen to their stories and then afterwards to say goodnight. Every one of these old people was over 90. They were as shriveled as prunes and as bony as skeletons. So again, as shriveled as prunes, that's some figurative language right there. He's comparing their skin to, like, a prune is like looks kind of like a large raisin, but it's actually a dried plum. So when he says their skin is as shriveled, think like shriveled up like a raisin almost. And then they're as bony as skeletons. So this is what good writers do. They make sure that you can have a picture in your mind as you're reading. Those are both metaphors. They compare, or those are both similes. They compare using as. It's a metaphor if they just said that they were prunes. So there's no as. When he says they're as shriveled as prunes, that's a simile. So they're comparing their skin to wrinkly prunes and their bodies as bony as skeletons. And throughout the day, until Charlie made his appearance, they lay huddled in their one bed, 2 at either end, with nightcaps on to keep their heads warm, dozing the time away, with nothing to do. But as soon as they heard the door opening and heard Charlie's voice saying, "Good evening, Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine and Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina," then all 4 of them would suddenly sit up and their old wrinkled faces would light up with smiles of pleasure, and the talking would begin. For they loved this little boy. He was the only bright thing in their lives, and his evening visits were something they looked forward to all day long. Often Charlie's mother and father would come in as well and stand by the door, listening to the stories that the old people told. And thus, for perhaps half an hour every night, this room would become a happy place, and the whole family would forget that it was hungry and poor. One evening, when Charlie went in to see his grandparents, he said to them, "Is it really true that Wonka's chocolate factory is the biggest in the world?" "True?" cried all 4 of them at once. "Of course it's true. Good heavens, didn't you know that? It's about 50 times as big as any other." Whenever we see the author use italics, and we've talked about that text feature, that means they're emphasizing it. So when he says, "Is it really true?" When you emphasize it, you kind of take the word and stretch it out. Or sometimes it's like a questioning tone. Is it really true that Wonka's chocolate factory is the biggest in the world? Practice that good reading expression. "Of course it's true. Good heavens, didn't you know that? It's about 50 times as big as any other. And is Mr. Wonka really the cleverest chocolate maker in the world?" "My dear boy," said Grandpa Joe, raising himself up a little on his pillow, "Mr. Wonka is the most amazing, the most fantastic, the most extraordinary chocolate maker that the world has ever seen. I thought everybody knew that. I knew he was famous, Grandpa Joe, and I knew he was very clever. Clever! Cried the old man. He's more than that. He's a magician with chocolate. He can make anything he wants. Isn't that a fact, my dears? The other three old people nodded their heads slowly up and down and said, absolutely true, just as true as can be. And Grandpa Joe said, you mean to say I've never told you about Mr. Willy Wonka and his chocolate factory? Oh, in his factory? Never, answered little Charlie. Good heavens above! I didn't know what's the matter with me. Will you tell me now, Grandpa Joe? Please? I certainly will. Sit down beside me on the bed, my dear, and listen carefully. Grandpa Joe was the oldest of the four grandparents. He was 96 and a half, and that is just about as old as anybody can be. Like all extremely old people, he was delicate and weak throughout the day. He spoke very little, but in the evening, when Charlie, his beloved grandson, was in the room, he seemed in some marvelous way to grow quite young again. All his tiredness would fade away from him, and he became as eager and excited as a young boy. Oh, what a man he is, this Willy Wonka, cried Grandpa Joe. Did you know, for example, that he has himself invented more than 200 new kinds of candy bars, each with a different center, each far sweeter and creamier and more delicious than anything the other chocolate factories can make? Perfectly true, cried Grandma Josephine. And he sends them to all the four corners of the earth. Isn't that so, Grandpa Joe? It is, my dear. It is. And to all the kings and presidents of the world as well. But it isn't only candy bars that he makes. Oh, dear me, no. He has some really fantastic inventions up his sleeve. Mr. Wonka has. Did you know that he's invented a way of making chocolate ice cream so that it stays cold for hours and hours without being in the icebox? You can leave it let me read that again. You can leave it lying in the sun all morning on a hot day and it won't go runny. But that's impossible, said little Charlie, staring at his, I think it's going to say grandparents. Let's flip. At his grandfather. Of course it's impossible, said Grandpa Joe. It's absolutely absurd, but Mr. Wonka has done it. Quite right, the others agreed, nodding their heads. Mr. Wonka has done it. And then again, Grandpa Joe went on, speaking very slowly now so that Charlie wouldn't miss a word. Mr. Willy Wonka can make marshmallows that taste of violets and rich caramels that change color every 10 seconds as you suck them. The little feathery sweets that melt away deliciously the moment you put them between your lips. He can make chewing gum that never loses its taste and candy balloons that you can blow up to enormous sizes before you pop them with a pin and gobble them up. And by a most secret method, he can make lovely bluebird eggs with black spots on them. When you put one of these in your mouth, it gradually gets smaller and smaller until there's nothing left except a tiny pink sugary baby bird sitting on the tip of your tongue. Grandpa Joe paused and ran the point of his tongue slowly over his lips. It makes my mouth water just thinking about it, he said. Mine too, said Charlie, but please go on. While they were talking, Mr. and Mrs. Bucket, Charlie's mother and father, had come quietly into the room, and now both of them were standing just inside the door listening. Tell Charlie about that crazy Indian prince, said Grandma Josephine. He'd like to hear that. You mean Prince Pondicherry? Said Grandpa Joe, and he began chuckling with laughter. Completely, Dottie, said Grandpa George. But very rich, said Grandma Georgina. What did he do? Asked Charlie eagerly. Listen, and I'll tell you. So now we're on Chapter 3, Mr. Wonka and the Indian Prince. Prince Pondicherry wrote a letter to Mr. Willy Wonka, said Grandpa Joe, and asked him to come all the way out to India and build him a colossal palace entirely out of chocolate. Did Mr. Wonka do it, Grandpa? He did indeed. And what a palace it was. It had 100 rooms and everything was made of either dark or light chocolate. The bricks were chocolate, and the cement holding them together was chocolate, and the windows were chocolate, and all the walls and ceilings were made of chocolate. So were the carpets and the pictures on the furniture and on the beds. And when you turned the taps in the bathroom, hot chocolate came pouring out. When it was all finished, Mr. Wonka said to Prince Pondicherry, "I warn you, though, it won't last very long, so you'd better start eating right away." "Nonsense!" shouted the prince. "I'm not going to eat my palace. I'm not even going to nibble the staircase or lick the walls. I'm going to live in it." But Mr. Wonka was right, of course, because soon after this, there came a very hot day with a boiling sun, and the whole palace began to melt. And then it sank slowly into the ground, and the crazy prince, who was dozing in the living room at the time, woke to find himself swimming around in a huge brown sticky lake of chocolate. Little Charlie sat still on the edge of the bed, staring at his grandfather. Charlie's face was bright, and his eyes were stretched so wide that you could see all the whites all around. "Is all this really true?" he asked. "Or are you pulling my leg?" So that's an idiom, and that means, are you joking or are you kidding me? "It's true!" cried all four of the old people at once. "Of course it's true. Ask anyone you like." "And I'll tell you something else," said Grandpa Joe as he leaned closer to Charlie and lowered his voice to a soft, secret whisper. "Nobody ever comes out." "Out of where?" asked Charlie. "And nobody ever goes in." "In where?" cried Charlie. "In Wonka's factory, of course." "Grandpa, what do you mean?" "I mean workers, Charlie." "Workers? All factories," said Grandpa Joe, "have workers streaming in and out the front gates in the morning and evening, except Wonka's. Have you ever seen a single person going into that place or coming out?" Little Charlie looked slowly around at each of the four old faces, one after the other, and they all looked back at him. They were friendly, smiling faces, but they were also quite serious. There was no sign of joking or leg pulling on any of them. "Well, have you?" asked Grandpa Joe. I I really don't know, Grandpa," Charlie stammered. "Whenever I walk past the factory, the gates seem to be closed." "Exactly," said Grandpa Joe. "But there must be people working in there." "Not people, Charlie. Not ordinary people, anyways." "Then who?" cried Charlie. "Aha! That's it, you see. That's another of Mr. Wonka's cleverness." "Charlie, dear," Mrs. Bucket called out from where she was standing by the door, "it's time for bed. That's enough for tonight." "But, Mother, I must hear." "Tomorrow, darling." "That's right," said Grandpa Joe. "I'll tell you the rest of it tomorrow evening." And that's where we're pausing.